So if you play full ring online cash games and you've been using our new GTO Ranges app, you may have noticed that there are no actual GTO ranges given for online full ring cash game players. So why not? Let's talk about it today and I'll explain. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker, and I did want to explain and talk today about the GTO ranges and specifically why you're not going to find GTO ranges for online full ring cash games in the app. So one of the things you have to understand right off the bat is what GTO ranges actually are. So in order to get them, you'd use a GTO solver that's capable of doing preflop solves. Then you would use very, very capable hardware that's able to run such a solve. Then you would set up the entire game tree, and that's everything from preflop sizing strategies to postflop sizing strategies, and then you eventually are good with that, let the sucker rip, and then at some point in the future, and not necessarily the near future, you're going to get an entire output of preflop GTO ranges that the solver gives you. And by the way, that's usually in a format that's incredibly unwieldy. But the thing that's really important to understand is exactly what the solver is doing. So the solver is presupposing that every single person is going to play totally perfect at every single inflection point. That means they're going to check raise flops totally perfectly, going to bet rivers totally perfectly, they're going to 3-bet preflop totally perfectly from all positions at all times against every single opponent. Now, obviously, we're humans, we don't do that, we can't do that, we're not totally perfect. However, as you're playing in games where people are deviating further and further away from what the solver would suggest, the question then arises, why use the GTO output in the first place if there are possibly and almost certainly going to be better options available? And that's where the exploitative ranges come into play. But before we get there, it's really important to understand that full ring online cash games tend to cap out. There tends to be a pretty low ceiling for that game, meaning that even if you're playing on an online room that has pretty darn decent volume, it's very rare to find a bunch of full ring games that are running really above 50 no limit. And oftentimes, especially on smaller rooms, it's going to cap out somewhere closer to like 25 no limit. So in general, when you're playing this game, the higher up you go, typically the higher the skill level goes, which means the lower you are, the lower the skill level. And thus, the higher the skill level, chances are people are playing at least a little bit closer to solver approved, and the lower you go, the further and further away people are from solver approved play. Pretty simple, and I'm sure you've noticed that when you play online cash as well. I mean, just as a bare bones basic example, let's look at what the solver would suggest opening playing 8-handed full ring. So opening under the gun, it would raise 9.3% of hands, and notice that that is full ace-5 suited, full ace-4 suited, minimal inclusion of things like pocket 7s and pocket 6s and even pocket 8s, but there's also minimal inclusion of things like ace-6 suited and king-6 suited and king-9 suited, and there's full of things like queen-jack suited and king-10 suited. Now, think about the average reg who's playing in your online full ring cash games. Are they opening all of these hands preflop? Chances are no. Chances are they're actually much tighter than this. The fishy players are almost certainly going to be much wider than this. So you have massive deviation even just in the open raising ranges from under the gun, and that's usually a clue that you're probably not really going to want to stick extremely tight to a GTO solver output for those preflop ranges, because chances are there's some other things you could be doing that will be more profitable in the game. And that's just looking at under the gun raises, not even thinking about the way that they're likely to make post-flop mistakes or mistakes against 3 or 4 bets. These are very important considerations. So given all that, given the fact that we have that really low ceiling for these stakes, the really low ceiling for the skill level, it just makes a tremendous amount of sense to play tighter in these games, right? Just really capitalize on the fact that players are making a lot of mistakes, and you can make the exact same argument for playing online 6-max in the micros, right? Simply because why do you need to play pure GTO ranges? You can probably use something that's a little bit more geared and tailored towards actually exploiting the common weaknesses in that game, which is where the exploitative ranges come into play. Because if you're not going to use the GTO ranges, then what should you use? And the exploitative ones are exactly what you should be looking at next. So if you have the app open, you can just go to full ring cash off the home screen, then exploitative, and you see all of the major preflop buckets from there. And really what you want to understand is what exploitative ranges are. Whenever you're given preflop ranges, an entire set of them, you want to understand what kind of parameters went into them, and especially if it's GTO, you want to have a basic idea idea of the game tree. If it's exploitative like this, then you want to understand kind of what it's actually exploiting at the end of the day, and if they've actually been tested in any capacity. So first and foremost, I can definitely tell you that these ranges have been tested. They've been exhaustively tested both in online environments and also in live cache, playing at like the 1-2 level. This is a very, very good set of preflop ranges for full ring games, whether you're playing like 8 or 9 handed. These will definitely fit the bill very, very nicely. And essentially what we did is we had our team sit down and say, okay, what ranges do we want to include for sure, and what are the major weaknesses in the player pool that we can take advantage of and create preflop ranges that do exactly that. So that's looking at the kind of preflop inaccuracies that our opponents are having in their overall strategy, also the postflop mistakes that they tend to make, because if your opponents play decently preflop but make like huge blunders postflop, then you might not want to get overly tight preflop. So we kind of factored all that in mind, looked at things like rake factors, and then started creating these ranges from there. And there is one thing that I wanted to mention that I don't think I've touched on yet, and that is the inclusion of multi-way pots. Now, a lot of game tree creators, when they're trying to set up a preflop solve, will just kind of shortcut this all together and say, okay, no one's going to call preflop. So if someone open raises, the only option a player has after them is to 3-bet or fold. Can't call. No, that simplifies the game tree immensely. It makes things much, much easier. The issue, though, is like we already talked about earlier, the full ring stake ceiling tends to be much lower, and as such, the skill level seems to be much lower, and as such, there are lots of multi-way pots in the real world. Same thing when you're playing live cache. Of course, if you've played any 1-2, you know that multi-way pots are quite common. So just note that we did keep the possibility, or more likely high probability, of multi-way pots when we were doing the exploitative ranges build for this one. And we also included multiple callers as an option when we were building out the live GTO solve that'll be coming out shortly, which was actually factored into the open raising range we looked at a moment ago. So just wanted to give you that extra information if you're curious. And we also went a step further and included not just base level ranges, but also optional hands to include as well where appropriate. So if you're a little bit newer, not really confident yet, you're still working on your preflop and your postflop skills, just use the ranges in red. It'll be a little bit tighter, but it'll keep you out of trouble, and no problem, rock and roll, go from there. If you do feel a bit more comfortable, you're able to identify some more of your edges, especially preflop, but even postflop too, then you can throw in the yellow optional hands. It'll make you a little bit looser and go from there. But again, if you're newer, stick to the red ranges. They're a little bit tighter and a little bit easier to use as well. So as a point of comparison, if we were to compare the GTO open raising from under the gun range we looked at earlier to the under the gun open raising exploitative range in the app, you notice that if you just use the tighter red ranges in the exploitative stuff, it's going to be tighter than the GTO suggestion. And if you throw in the red plus the optional yellows, you're going to get a little bit looser than the GTO suggestion, which is right in track with what we want to be thinking about in games like this, where the player pool tends to have issues and pretty big issues in their overall strategy. Then the exploitative ranges really can come to life for you. So hopefully that helps give you a little bit of extra context on why there are no GTO ranges available for online full ring cache game players in the app. Again, this is very, very intentional, thinking about skill levels, thinking about the way the game is right this moment, the way the game will probably go in the future as well, where you're probably going to see full ring die off more and push more online play to 6-max games or other variants. So hopefully that gives you, again, the context you need to understand this decision. And by the way, if you like what you're seeing here, you can download the app today, redchip.app, to download it. It's available for both Apple devices and Android devices, and it has everything you need. Even if you just download it for free, you can get all of our open raising ranges. That includes exploitative ranges and also GTO ranges when available. And remember that you can always unlock full access to the app at any time and get access to not just the open raising ranges, but also 3-bet ranges, calling ranges, 4-bet ranges, everything you need to be competitive in today's preflop games. You're going to have the exact range set you need for the exact games you play to make sure that you are exactly where you need to be in your preflop strategy. And that is going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you so much for hanging out today. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. And of course, a thumbs up on the video if you enjoyed would be massively appreciated as well. Otherwise, I'll see you back shortly with a brand new video. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.